Okay. So this is the list of speakers we have. And as I said, I'm going to introduce them when it's time for them to speak. So this is the list of lessons. This is the only slide I prepared for them. So they're going to talk about these topics. I'm going to introduce the first speaker because Julie actually has another engagement she has to attend to. So she has to leave at 5:30. So she's going to be the first speaker for today. So I'm not going to introduce Julie. It's a very long list, so I'm going to cut it short so that it will not eat into your 12 minutes. As many of you, Julie's a from the San Francisco Superior Court. Retirement, before her judgeship, Julie worked as an assistant district attorney in San Francisco and served 3 terms as the president of San Francisco Community Board. Upon retirement, Judge Tang co-founded the Comfort Women Redress Coalition and also the Pivot to Peace. She was named the Outstanding Chinese American by San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Without getting into any more details, I'll now pass the floor to Julie.
Okay, I have a little PowerPoint that I prepared, but I'm basically a low-tech person. So I put this together last night and didn't do a very good job. So if you just bear with me, okay? All right. First of all, thank you so much for being here, and it's a pleasure to be among Chinese overseas and people who are concerned and interested in what's happening to the Chinese American community throughout the world, especially the ones who left China and found new homes elsewhere. You know, the good thing about being the last to present here is that you listen to all the presentations and you kind of get an idea what people are talking about, how they're feeling. And I have a feeling that there has been a sort of like an informal consensus developed from among the speakers. And that is Chinese Americans are confronting a new level of racism and discrimination that is rooted in the current US containment policy against China. Now, our experience since the Obama pivot to Asia, Trump's trade war, Biden's all-inclusive economic war against China is unprecedented. We're living in a dangerously insane world where our US leaders are increasingly hostile and turning warmongering on China on the unsupported rationale that China is our enemy and an existential threat. We adopt policies such as the trade war, which boomerang back to us, and we're still in high inflation, and also recently a chips ban on China that kneecapped our own most productive industry, the chip manufacturing industry. I think one of our panelists, George Koo, will be talking more about that, so I'm going to let him elaborate on that. But our leaders appear to be lost and confused and blinded by an unsubstantiated claim that China's rise will drive us into poverty or remove us from any prominence in the world leadership. I don't think so. As a Chinese American, I think being a hegemon, living in a country that considers itself hegemon, is really a lot of burden to carry, not only financially, but look at all the wars that we fought to maintain that status and the regime to change and the disasters that we wreaked in other countries, trying to determine which leader would suit us best. That's too much to carry with us. I would rather be like a little country where the leaders are concerned about its citizens, adopt policies that look out for our interest, and really care about our everyday concerns, about how we live, about our survivability, and for Chinese Americans in particular, our citizenships. Because throughout the centuries, our citizenship have been threatened again and again with deportation issues and persecutions and the likes of which that take us back to the law, the only law that was passed that was used to ban a particular race from immigration into this country, and that would be the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Now, that law was preceded by the Page Act, which was targeted against Chinese women. It didn't say so, but it was particularly targeted at Chinese women because they were perceived as prostitutes coming into this country. So they were actually, there was a law against Chinese women, followed by a law against Chinese men. These laws leaves Chinese Americans very vulnerable to any laws that are passed, and also the relationship between US and China, because anything that happens could shake the status that we have in this country. We have seen how certain groups among the best and the brightest, like Judge Singh was saying this morning, the elitists among us who do research in the scientific field to make lives better for us, how they are persecuted and racial profiled, subjected to immense suffering and harm, only to come out triumphantly as heroes and heroines because of their willingness to fight and their resilience and the determination to not the system or bad US policy bear them down. But we also have our good moments, and somebody talk about panda hugging, panda bashing. I lived through a period of panda of which I was a beneficiary. And I can share with you 3 pieces of law that actually benefited me. And let me see if those, there are 3 laws, 2 are treatises and 1 is a law. The two treaties actually benefited Chinese Americans. The first is the Burlingame Treaty. The Burlingame Treaty was initiated by a diplomat in China. His name is Ensign Burlingame. What he did was to negotiate a law between the Manchurian government. At that time in 1868, China was ruled by the Manchurians with the United States that allowed unrestricted immigration into states. But I think more importantly about those treaties that I read was that it was embedded with decorum, mutual respect, and deference to each other. And that's how countries should relate diplomatically. And I think of the Burlingame Treaty as a blueprint, possibly, for diplomacy between the United States and China. But for now, it's not happening. But we still have a blueprint where it did happen. The second law that, second treaties, well, actually it's a piece of law that affected me personally, and that is the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. President Johnson signed that law equating, allowing China to have 20,000 quotas of immigration, and that equates to all other countries' immigration, thereby leveling the playing field for immigration to this country. When that was signed in 1965, actually the law was initiated by President John Kennedy in 1962. My family was a beneficiary of that law because our family emigrated to this country shortly after the 1965. The third treaties that I think benefited not just which it did, but all of you, every single Chinese American person, as well as non-Chinese persons in America, and that is the Shanghai Communique. With this Shanghai Communique, which were 3 sets, 1972, 1989, and 72, 79, and 82, culminated into 3 very important conditions upon which United States and China relate. Number 1 is that one China policy. There's only one China. The second condition is that Taiwan is part of China. The third condition is that if there are any conflicts between straits between Taiwan and China, the issue would be resolved by the Chinese over there in the Taiwan Straits, and not by foreign interference. There were 40 years of peace, progress, and prosperity. And I, for one, utilized the opportunities that were offered to me, worked hard, myself a position, entrenched in the US government jobs as an assistant district attorney, And then I became a community college board member, 3-term president, and then finally retired as a judge in 2014. But these good times don't last too long, unfortunately. Right now, we are looking at a new law called the Taiwan Policy Act. If it were to be passed, it would create nothing but havoc in the Taiwan Straits, because what it did is it upended a long-standing policy of the One China policy. The two main features of the Taiwan Policy Act, which is already left the committee in the Senate, the Foreign Relations Committee, and is waiting for passage from both the Senate and the Congress, would basically turn Taiwan into like an independent entity, conferring a special status, non-NATO ally status. And with that, United States will give Taiwan $4.5 billion in aid in weapon acquisition, and embed itself into the civil government of Taiwan, as well as in the military training and practice, share interoperabilities of the two of United States and Taiwan, so that Taiwan would be like Ukraine, be ready to defend itself if ever there is an attack from China. But it is actually the opposite. When build up a place like that, it give false hope to Taiwan people that they could achieve independence through military means. United States help with the practice wars that they have done and all the comparable military maneuvers that the Pentagon has used a war to determine who lead. It appears that there's no hope that China will not have an opportunity to retake Taiwan even by force, and China has said as much. But China prefers a peaceful region and invested a lot of resources and energy to promote that. And I'm sorry, it may not happen. I'm still working very hard with my group, Pivot to Peace. Then what can we do? I think there were a lot of good ideas given. What I've done is that in 2020, I've worked with a group of peace activists. My partner in crime, Judge Lillian Singh and KJ No over there, we formed a group called Pivot to Peace. And the vision of this group is to use education to promote understanding China issues and correct misinformation, which, and by the way, the Compete Act has made our work much harder, because the Compete Act authorized $500 million for the next 4 years to use as propaganda, funding media channels to spread China, and Radio Free, Radio Asia, Free Radio, whatever that is, will be one of the recipients, and also global media, which means that outside media would also partake in the funding of this $500 million. That's a lot of money. And that's why we've actually been seeing KJ and our group, a lot of publications from all these journalists whose name we hardly know, or who knew before, who used to be neutral, are all turning very anti-China. And that kind of brainwashing and propaganda is very dangerous. We are basically a peace group looking towards peace with politicians. We lobby against bad legislation and censorship. Judge Singh and I have personally spoken to Dianne Feinstein on the phone, advocating for issues. I don't know if we had anything to do with it, but we did talk to her about a host of issues, and she, only politician who actually had done anything helpful to China and to in terms of peacekeeping, single-handedly blocked the exemption that would allow U.S. citizens to fight against pandemic. And we also spoke to her Firewood nomination. I don't know where it is now, but no news is good news. We basically are a mini think tank, but also take a street fighter stance when necessary. And we did a demonstration. So before I sit down, I know my time is limited. I want to show you some of the pictures that we took during demonstrations. Oh my goodness. I mean, when I was a judge, I was not demonstrate, get involved in politics. This last year, I think I have demonstrated more than I ever done in my entire lifetime. But I want to share with you some of the pictures, okay? See, okay, this is a banner I really want to share with everybody. It says, fight the virus, not the people. The person in the red was me, okay? And what we did was that in 2020, sometime in February, Chinatown was suffering. Zero, but okay, very quickly. This banner was curated by this Smithsonian National Museum of American History, and it is currently on exhibit at the lobby. Could you? Yeah, this is Chinese media report on that scroll. This is the Smithsonian. We took this picture 3 weeks ago, and it is in next. That's not me. Okay, and then this is another demonstration that we did. But what I wanted to do is that I don't think our advocacy has went for naught. We are being heard, and we also demonstrated. And you keep going. We demonstrated. We put up. We dropped a banner in Japan calling for attention. Communicate anniversary 50th anniversary. Can you scroll it? And also we demonstrated at Nancy Pelosi's house, and that was me. And we demonstrated building against Pelosi's Taiwan visit. And, what we did is that we chanted, Pelosi, Pelosi, can you see? China's not our enemy. So, I mean, giving decisions, chanting slogans. But I really believe that what we've done has been useful. And we may have a connection at some point. I hope not. But for Chinese Americans, we have one choice, is to keep working towards restoring the sanity and rationality that once predominates our government. And Pivot to Peace will continue to work, approaching it from an educational, intellectual perspective, street fighter stance when necessary. And go to the last slide at this time. Okay, and Vice President Winston Churchill, never give up. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Professor Gordon Chang. Professor Chang is a professor of history at Stanford University, and he's a former director of the Center for East Asian Studies. He has also been a founding director of the Asian American Studies program at Stanford. He published Gold Mountain, the epic history of Chinese who built the transcontinental railroad. That's an excellent book. If you haven't bought it, you should buy a copy. And he wrote many other books, including a book called Friends and Enemies, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. He's a former director of the Center for East Asian Studies, Professor Gordon Chang.
Thank you very much, Don, and thank you for Locke and Ling Chi, old friends of mine, for inviting me to the program here and this chance to speak. And I'm going to use at least all the 15 minutes. And I just want to say before I start talking that to the relief of some of you and maybe the disappointment of others, I'm Chang that you might see at Fox News. And actually, even this morning, somebody came up to me and was sort of perplexed of why was that Gordon Chang at this meeting? And because I said, I'm not that Gordon Chang. So I'm happy, and I'll say a little bit more about that connection in a moment. I have lots to say, and I'm sort of addressing these. I actually got these questions after I wrote the talk. So, but you can continue your material to these very important questions. So we know the current situation for Chinese in America is bad, as Julie has pointed out. And it's been the worst in decades, if not even longer. We know that a bad U.S.-China relationship for Chinese Americans. So I have further comment on a moment, but I want to share just a few anecdotes, a few stories from my experiences at Stanford in recent years that will speak to this issue. Some of these developments may not be as well known to you, but illustrate some of the dimensions of this fraught situation that we first had. that we now have. Now, first, in 20, several years before the start of the COVID crisis and Trump's COVID demagogy, there was already deliberate public targeting of Chinese Americans, not just from the federal government, but from academics. As a targeting of Chinese Americans as a suspect population. The conservative Hoover Institution, which the other Gordon connections with. And that, I tell you, that pisses me off, and because we are confused all the time and I get hate mail or praise for him. So it's really terrible. But Hoover Institution published a very lurid report entitled Chinese Influences and American Interests. And some of you may have seen that. It's still available in Amazon books. The report drew attention to the alleged work of Chinese, everyday people such as us here, who are secretly working for the interests of Beijing against democracy in America. The report first kinds of race baiting, red baiting, guilt negotiation, misinformation, and ignorant claims and extreme language. Ling you just mentioned a little while ago about the issue of loyalty that came up during the Cold War, and this report just revived, is to tapped into that whole a longstanding fear that many Americans have about the alleged loyalty or disloyalty of Chinese in America. Among the so-called evidence that this report raised was the activity of my friend and co-panelist here, George Wu. According to the report, mild-mannered George was a secret agent, literally, was a secret agent of Beijing in the interests of China. It was pure slander, and in all honesty and sincerity, George, it pained me greatly to see how you were mistreated by Hoover Institution and also in the press. And there was not the defense of George that should have been. The report pointed to other threats to America, including traditional Chinese family associations on Chinatown over here, popular Chinese language newspapers, and universities, all named with scurrilous accusation. To make it seem there was widespread conspiracy of Chinese, everyday Chinese, against American interests. Another target of this report was Stanford physicist Shoucheng Zhang, who was just in his mid-50s in age at that time, just a few years ago. He was a brilliant scientist rumored to be in line for a Nobel Prize, and some of you know this terrible case. He and his wife also formed an important investment company that supported Chinese companies wanting to do work in the US at that time, which was promoted by the federal government. That brought him to the attention of the Hoover people. A few days after the release of their report, the Hoover report, and as a separate US trade report, both specifically or implicitly named Shoucheng as someone who was working to steal US technology for China. And then he jumped to his death here in San Francisco, just a few blocks away from this hotel, literally just a few blocks from here. Now, Shoucheng defended him and said he was doing nothing wrong and nothing was ever proven that he was doing something illegal. He had been suffering from depression, and I can't really say that the report caused his death, but it certainly contributed to the emotional distress that led to that terrible tragedy. Now, one of the leading authors of that report is the very well-known and influential China historian, China scholar, Orville Schell, perhaps the most famous China scholar in the United States at this time. In his earlier career, he had been an admirer of Mao and the Cultural Revolution and wrote books about it. Maybe some of you have read some of his early books. Now, he praises Donald Trump. He said Donald Trump was right for Donald Trump got China right, and Trump understands China's dangers as Orville Schell. He's connected to Columbia University and is a leader of the Asia, and he continues to see Beijing as an existential threat and enemy to the United States. And he's representative of a number of China scholars who've now flipped. We also know of the cases of Gang Chang, Xiaoxing Qi, and Sherry Chen, and congratulations to them and praise to them for fighting and standing up for all of us and for the reason of Sherry's name, which was long overdue. But over the years, since their famous, well-known cases, the federal government continued to investigate China-connected scholars. Just at Stanford that I know, I have attended meetings colleagues. I've only real Chinese American, that is to say, someone who's born in the United States, these colleagues who were born in China have come forward and shared shocking stories of their mistreatment, stories that have never gotten into the press, have not made it to the courts, and so forth. They told stories. One young, I'm old, but she's younger. She's got a family, a lovely, wonderful, smart chemist, has talked about how one Sunday morning, FBI agents came to her campus home, banged on the door, demanded to come into their home, and her husband and children stood at the door and refused to let them come in the house. So yay to them. And she was so proud of them. But the others came forward, one had come forward with these stories because they're all isolated, intimidated, in fear of the consequences. This is just going on for a handful of some faculty who are brave enough to come forward just at my university. So in other words, there must be hundreds, thousands of other cases that have not been reported, that have not been recorded, and we just don't even know the number of incidents that have transpired and continue to transpire. Now, but the harassment doesn't come just from the state. A close Stanford colleague of mine, also in the sciences, she's a leader, one of the most prominent scientists today, I won't mention her name, has been the target of accusations that she's a spy in social media. It has been onslaught against her. She's received death threats against her. Where have these come? They've come from other Chinese who are virulently Beijing and believe she is working against the United States and want to even go further than the federal government against her and others. So this highlights a point that we might discuss further. The hostile U.S.-China relations creates discord among Chinese and other Asians in America, the federal government against many, but also within our own communities who are now beginning to fight against their finger point each other and advocate for even more aggressive action as it did during the 1950s, as we were talking about when we were involved in Chinatown politics some time ago. And I just heard that, I think Ling Chitoff told me this morning, that this scientist has just announced that she's leaving the United States to return to China. And I cannot believe, I must believe this because of the terrible harassment that she's suffered. Now, this point about intra-Asian or intra-China discord conflict, we also saw this in the recent election cycle down in Orange County, just on but leading to election, there is a race between Michelle Steele, some of you may know him from Southern California, a Korean-American Republican, and this is down in Orange County, who ran against Jay Chen, who identifies as a Democrat and a Taiwanese American. But Steele campaigned against Chen, sent out campaign literature accusing him of serving Beijing. She even issued flyers that photoshopped him holding the Communist Manifesto in a classroom with posters in the background of Mao, Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, and Bernie Sanders. She claimed he was bringing China into our classrooms and was China's choice in the county schools. Chen denounced the smear. He's actually a naval officer. He was president of the local community college district, and the other day, Chen lost his deal. So I got the one other thing, which is sort of a really bizarre story about this problem about intra-Asian tensions. Friends of mine in China wrote me recently, and they wanted to know, was it really true that Leland Stanford, the benefactor of my university, buried alive 150,000 Chinese railroad workers? And as you know, I've written a lot about rail workers. And that is circulating in China now. And this is now Professor Wentie Renmin University has gone viral with this accusation. He's a well-known academic in China and is riling up people to attack Stanford alumni in China that they accused, ashamed for being connected to Stanford University because of what Leland Stanford did with burying alive 150,000. Now, he should know, he studied and worked at the University of Michigan, Cornell, Columbia, USC, but the It's the tip of the iceberg of this is what's going on there. Now, what about the future? And I'm going to talk really fast here, and I had to cut out some stuff. I think we're going into what I would call a new normal, or maybe another way of putting it, returning to the old normal. In the past 20 years or so, late 1990s to the teens were actually anomalous, was an unusual period, the past 20 years, a little before the past 20 years. And we became accustomed to the comparatively hopeful, or at least conditions in the US because of a relatively positive US-China relationship based mainly on business. I can talk about that relationship with students, business, and so forth. I have to cut all that out. Just to highlight that example, even Trump's grandchildren studied Chinese. You know, they're not going to do that anymore. I mean, that's just where we changed in time. So it's going to be a long time if we see anything similar. So what do we mean by the old? What do I mean by the old normal? From 1850, when the Chinese came in significant numbers, to 1943, as Julie pointed out, we had China's going to become naturalized citizens. In the 1950s, we had divided Chinese Americans, with the conservatives turning on the liberals and the left in the Chinese communities. It was terrible for Chinese Americans in many ways. The federal government stepped up surveillance of Chinese communities, and the suspicion of Chinese as loyal or disloyal inhabitants of America was. In the 1980s, we saw regular examples of terrible conditions and tragedy for Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. In 1982, we see Vincent Chin, which you, I hope, all know about. A few years later, there were other murders of young Asian Americans, which can go. All right, and Cindy and Lee down in butchered by white supremacists, and then highlighted. And some of you may not know this, but you should know this, in 1989, the year of normalization with the US, a racist gunman dressed in military fatigues shot 37 school children and staff at Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California. 5 children died by the of Southeast Asian ancestry. He targeted Southeast Asian Asians. The 1990s and so forth. So the presidential campaign, we saw widespread allegations, illegal efforts of Chinese nationals and Chinese Americans to gain influence in the so-called Riadi contribution scandal and the Clinton presidential. A point during that time was the conservative meaning racialized the episode and raised the specter of the corruption of US political institutions by China. The FBI investigated scores of Chinese all around the country. This was the first time a lot of Chinese began to give political contributions, get politically involved, and then just clamped down on them, and they became really demoralized and scared. And even my cousin, who was just a regular restaurant guy, the FBI called him out of the blue because he'd given some money, campaign money. The resulting cloud and stigma from the scrutiny set back Chinese Americans and involvement in American politics for decades. And in 1999, we had the arrest of Wen Ho Lee. So as I look ahead, I see Sinophobia and anti-Asian racism entrenching themselves in American life. US-China relations will never resume to what they were in the early 20th century. Instead, we look at the recently concluded midterm election and the open use now of anti-Semitism, the ugliest anti-Semitism, even black anti-racism that was involved, that was used for political advantage. This is instructive to us, I think. And we saw a most egregious example of this in the Pennsylvania governor's race, where there was open use of anti-Semitic to the Jewish candidate. So with anti-Semitism rise, along with racism and phobia, why should we expect anything different than the old normal in social attitudes toward Asian Americans in the coming years?
Thank you very much. The next speaker is KJ No, and he has also a distinguished career. And let me just say a couple of words because we really don't have time. KJ No is a German political analyst, writer, teacher, and actor in geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. He writes all kinds of articles in various journals, and he's also very active in Pivot to Peace. let me just end with that and I leave it because here's a long talk.
It's enough, yeah. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to warn you that I may go a little bit over time. Everybody, I'm going to do an Oprah here. I want you to reach under your chairs and look for a piece of paper. You should see a piece of red paper under your chairs. And pull that up. And if you have it, just good. And could you read some of those papers, what it says on there? Anybody? Popcorn. Misawa. More. Excellent. Quick question to you. Do you know what those are? Those are US bases. And I guarantee you, under every single one of those chairs is a red piece of paper that has the name of a US base.
Around the world.
Around the Pacific. And even those chairs in the far back, every single one of them has the name of a US base. So what I'm telling you is that for China, when China looks out at the Pacific, what does it see? It sees itself encircled with US bases. So my presentation is called A Storm Blowing In from Paradise. Is there time to awaken the dead? This is a reference to Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, the Jewish philosopher, who was feeling the Holocaust tighten around him. And he was trying to escape to Italy. And on the way, he was caught on the Italian border and he committed suicide. Okay. I'm warning you that the situation that we're seeing right now is not unlike that of Germany and Europe in the 1930s, 1940s. So it's about the US war on China. And this war is really about information war. Information war is a form of hybrid warfare. People say that this is a Cold War. No, it's a hot war. But this hot war is preceded by hybrid war, which is there is a subkinetic or pre-kinetic dimension of this war. So, and then the language matters. The language matters because the language has already been captured. And so you are not going to be able to get a clear read on what is happening unless you start to understand the language. There's a fire hose of falsehoods. There's psychological projection. Before soldiers go to war, the language goes to war. So here are some of these words that you will hear. Rules-based international order. It means US hegemonic order. Threat. It means a country that does not subordinate itself to US hegemony. Autocratic means not submissive to the United States. Democratic means subservient capitalist state. Anti-access area denial is a funny term that the Pentagon wonks have invented. It refers to China's defensive capacity. But notice that they can't say that China's defensive capacity is a threat to the United States. So they have to say China's A2AD capacities are an existential threat to the United States. And I also want you to notice the language highly gendered around access and the frustration around denial. That always plays into military language. Phone-op freedom of navigation is simply a show of force. Revisionist power is a polite term for enemy. Competition is a word that they use instead of war. Containment, which some of us have been using incorrectly, means regime change or rollback. Allies are vassals. Genocide, they use this term to refer to a program of development in Xinjiang. To zent something is to fraudulently exaggerate something. And you see Adrian Zentz on Democracy Now! And other progressive programs spewing lies about a non-existent genocide. Security means imperial interests, shared liberal values, settler, colonial, white supremacist values. International community, anytime you hear that word, it means 8 to 12% of the global population, the Western elite countries, etc. All lies. Information war precedes kinetic war. So this is what it looks like on the map. It's a complete arc of encirclement. Preparing a war, the question is not if, but how. Is it going to be ambidextrous, China and Russia at the same time, or is it going to be sequential? There's a war doctrine that's been developed since 2009. It's called air-sea battle. Air-sea battle was based on air-land battle. Air-sea battle was based on air-land battle, which was the doctrine of total war against the Soviet Union. They have a version for China. It's called air-sea battle. It was applied in Kosovo and all subsequent US wars. These things get used. They don't just write them up. And then there's something called the third offset, which is the idea that when you wage war, you disperse your forces as much as possible in order to counter the first offset, which is mass, and the second offset, which is precision. It's a game of rock, paper, scissors. This is what the hybrid warfare looks like. They're looking at the contestation of all domains. It's a multi-domain warfare, and you can see that it involves political, economic, social, infrastructural, informational dimensions. And there's also a document from Rand, Thinking Through the Unthinkable, and they're talking about how to take down China, because all you have to do is wage a war in the South China Sea, where $5.3 trillion worth of China's trade and 77% of its oil goes through. And the understanding is that China's GDP will fall by 25 to 35%. In other words, it will bring around a catastrophic circumstances that could end in regime change. This could imperil China's stability and its development, undermine the legitimacy of the state. Okay, South Korea has a role in this. This is a South Korean lawmaker, and the person on top of him is Curtis J. Scaparotti. He's the US FK general who is riding piggyback on top of a high-ranking Korean lawmaker. It's a client state. The US has operational control over all of China's troops. All of South Korea's troops, 3.5 million of them. Yoon Suk-yeol has offered South Korea's entire foreign policy in service of the United States. Explicit, comprehensive understanding that it will support the US in all war-fighting domains. With the Philippines, Anthony Blinken said that an armed attack on the Philippine armed forces would invoke US mutual defense commitments. Okay, so the Philippines is also part of this, and you can see the bases involved. Taiwan is nothing but provocation. I'll get to that in a second, but I'm saying the fat is smoking in the pan. There is an epidemic of attacks on Asians, and this is after Trump. After Trump was put out of office and silenced, they continue to escalate. So it's not about Trump. They're happening all over the world, and they're inseparable from the warmongering on China. That is to say, a wholesale policy of hate mongering trickles down into retail violence, and Asians are collateral damage. So these are just some of the different dimensions of this warfare: economic, tech war, legal warfare, diplomatic warfare, military brinksmanship, civil subversion, academic warfare. Why is the US at war? Of course, this is Martin Luther's three evils: militarism, materialism, racism. But we also have to understand the history, which Gordon has also spoken of. There's been a long history of race war against China. The largest lynchings in the United States were of Chinese. In Antioch, not far from here, the Chinese had to dig tunnels under the ground so that they could go from work to their homes. This is where we get the term "a Chinaman's chance." And of course, anti-Asian sentiment has been endemic. It has to do with the fact that China stood up. And we can track this cursus or this policy through the Defense Planning Guidance document, the Project for a New American Century, the Bush Doctrine, the Obama Doctrine, the Trump Doctrine, and the Biden Doctrine. There's a consistency throughout it. Got it. And one of the people who was behind this engineering of these doctrine was a man called Andrew Marshall. He was the model for Dr. Strangelove, and he was the advisor to 12 secretaries of defense. And he had two key obsessions. One was US supremacy, and the other was preventing China's rise to power. He mentored these people. I'm talking about Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Cohen, Krapinovich, Pillsbury, Herman Kahn, Richard Pearl, a rogues gallery. These people went off and started wars. These people are not lightweights. There were also the blue team members: Michael Ledeen, Frank Gaffney, Robert Kagan, Bill Kristol, Elliot Abrams, John Bolton. These people, you do not trifle with them. Andrew Krapinovich created the doctrine of air-sea battle. Michael Pillsbury was the China expert for Trump. And of course, we have Frank Gaffney, who was very, very close to Secretary Pompeo. And he said, there is no hope of coexistence with China. And these are other quotes. Make no mistakes, China is a hostile foreign power. The Chinese will lead us into national slavery. This is Paul Wolfowitz. This is the Defense Planning Guidance document. This became the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia became the Bush Doctrine, the Obama Doctrine, and Nancy Pelosi was a very important part of the blue team. The evolution goes from the Heartland Theory to the Grand Chess Game to the Defense Planning Guidance document to the Project for a New American Century to the pivot to Asia. There's a 100-point plan. The offset strategies. Taiwan is a key issue of this. The Taiwan Policy Act is really important here. The plan is to provoke war. The strategy of denial is written up by Elbridge Colby, who wrote the U.S. National Defense Strategy. He has a 20-step syllogism on why the U.S. must go to war with China. Go read it in Time magazine. It's astounding. Korea is going to be part of this. This is the reason China is seen as an existential threat. But of course, we know China is not a threat. It's not a nuclear threat. It's not a threat to your lifestyle. It's not a threat to your grandchildren. But it is multipolarity is a threat. Because China's example says that modernization does not have to equal westernization, does not have to equal capitalism. So it's an ideological threat. It's the threat of a good example. And the US wants to take down China. A parasite sees a host's effort to free itself as an existential threat. Okay, let me just tell you one more thing. There are some errors that people are making. The first error that we're making when we resist this is to divide and submit. That's what the people oppressing us want us to do. So this is where we come out and say we criticize China, not Chinese American, or we criticize the CPC, but not Chinese, or we criticize Chinese, but not Asians. This is a way to get everybody messed up. And you can see this, even some of the noble organizations are still spewing this horrific line where they say that we do not preclude critiques of China, but protect the well-being of Asians and Asian Americans. You can't distinguish the two. It's too far gone. This is like saying, this is like a domestic violence victim saying, you can hit me, but only as much as I deserve, or only if I deserve it. It's not going to work. You have to challenge the fundamental premise, and don't confuse, don't disconnect the micro and the macro, and don't get focused on microaggressions. If you asked to be killed by a sniper and not a machine gun, that's not going to make things any easier for you. It's going to terrorize you more. I think that's enough. Thank you.
Our last panelist is George Koo. He's also very distinguished, and let me just very briefly mention a few things. George has been involved in the China environment for many years, advising U.S. companies in doing business in China. He also writes regularly for articles on U.S.-China relationship. Especially on the persecution over these last few years of Chinese Americans and Chinese in the United States. George is educated at the MIT Stephen Institute and Santa Clara University. Without further ado, let me introduce you to George.
Good evening, and good morning elsewhere. Good day, wherever you are. I appreciate the invitation. Vinci and I have a very similar background. We grew up in Xiamen, in a little island in the harbor. We went to the same elementary school, and we left Xiamen the same year, 1949. So in theory, we should be very old friends, but we didn't meet until we were in San Francisco about 30 years ago, instead of 70 years ago. But anyway, I volunteer to be the cleanup speaker. Now, in baseball, when you bat fourth, you are considered the strongest hitter. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting just the opposite, because I knew we have an all-star battery of speakers, and I knew that they're going to cover everything. So I figured, well, I might as well just write what I want to say and post it in Asia Times yesterday. and if you are curious, just Google my name, and Biden's remaining years look bleak. That's the title on Asia Times. So what I'm going to do today is I wrote up 4 pages of talking points, and I check off all the ones that they've all covered. So I'm going to just speak on things that they have not covered. And the first thing has to do with what it means to be a loyal American. Now, Gordon has touched on it. KJ has touched on it. A loyal American does not mean being loyal to our federal government or even the local government. A loyal American means you exercise your citizens' right and speak up when your government is wrong. When your future of your kids and your grandchildren are threatened by the warlike policies, by the discrimination, by the racist policies, you have to speak up. And I'm so encouraged by Sherry, by Xiaoxing Xi, and by Professor Chen Gang. You know, they are doing the right thing, and we all have to support them. I will come back and talk about my alma mater, the president of my alma mater, because I'm very proud of what he did. So some of the points that I want to point that hasn't been covered. What Biden administration has continued the Trump's policy is totally a lose-lose outcome. The Americans are going to lose, and the Chinese are going to lose. because instead of a one big global economy, as a result of the semiconductor war, there will be two much smaller economy. And people are going to be losing jobs. Already the Silicon Valley companies, major companies, Applied Material, Lam Research, they're starting to lay off people already because over 30% of their sales goes to China, only 8% to Silicon Valley, to US. And they're being asked to kneecap themselves so that Washington can kneecap China in the semiconductor development. That is a total lose-lose situation. I submit Chinese in America has more than pulled their weight. I'll give you a few apocryphal examples. Recently, there was an international math contest, and the first time in history, the US team beat the Chinese team. How do you know about that? Well, the damper in that development is all 5 high school students from the US are Chinese. You recently read about Wall Street Journal about how 1,400 Chinese American scientists have resigned, and I think the previous panel also talked about that. Well, they're leaving because they can't stand the pressure of being wrongly prosecuted. When you are wrongly prosecuted, your reputation is damaged. You go through all kinds of trauma, as the panel had talked about, and you are in the hole from legal bills, at least a couple $100,000. And the US government not only do not apologize when they're wrong, they do not pay compensation for the damages. They can charge you until you are guilty, until you're proven innocent, and they can walk away at any time, and they never hardly ever pay any damages, except in the case of Sherry Chen that we just talked about. I also knew another case, Su Haiping, who was also wrongly dismissed by NASA. And I got one of the more prestigious law firms in San Jose to take him on pro bono. And indeed, he won for wrongful dismissal, discrimination. He sued for, I don't know, $2 or $3 million on 7 counts. Now, we didn't have Lillian Singh or to preside, or Julie Tang to preside on that. The judge that presided on it threw out every case, every one of those counts except one. And for that one count, he was compensated $10,000. And I talked to him afterwards. I asked him how he felt. He says, my personality has totally changed. I don't socialize anymore. I don't talk to anybody anymore. But I am so convinced that I did the right thing. I had to stand up for my rights, and I had to go after the government, even though I got $10,000. According to Bloomberg News, I don't know if you recently heard this, but the Shanghai Tesla plant has done so well, so profitable, so efficient, so effective, that Musk has sent a couple of hundred technicians and technical people and bring them from China to the Fremont to get the Fremont plant operating up to snuff. So it's important that we all tell the same story, as KJ said, and not get involved in compromise or yes, but this part is exception and so on. We have to stand. We have to stand together. I want to just finish up ahead of time, right? With one quote from the outgoing president of MIT, Rafael Reif. Let me tell you a little bit about Rafael Reif. He was a first generation from Venezuela to go to college. He was accepted to graduate school. He didn't think he would get into MIT, actually. So he got into Stanford. Sorry about that. He got his PhD. He wrote some really breakthrough papers on the manufacturing of semiconductors. Then he had a teaching position at MIT, and he rose through MIT and became the president. So he had an immigration background, and he appreciated what Professor Chen Gang was going through, and he immediately stood behind him and picked up the legal bills and defended him to the end. And America should be ashamed, because he was the only president of a university that stood up and backed their Chinese American professors wrongly prosecuted, wrongly accused. So he has a quote that I just want to leave you with. If all we do in response to China's ambition is to try to double lock all our doors, I believe we will lock ourselves into mediocrity. And certainly I can vouch, our politicians in Washington is hurtling down that direction. Thank you.
I do have a couple of backup slides, just in case our panelists did not cover all the topics. But I think they did it. I think they did an excellent job. What is the reason that the United States and China are heading toward a head-on collision? China wants a multilateral world, but the United States wants a unilateral world following its rule-based order. As George Koo mentioned, the United States wants a unilateral world following not its rule-based order, its rule-based disorder. And this leads to conflicts and instabilities. And we have actually seen that over the world in the last 70 years. The United States instigated instabilities and regime changes over the world. Consequences of this head-on collision, regime changes and instability over the world, possibly leads to wars, including world wars and nuclear wars. It's not good for the United States, not good for the American people, not good for the Chinese people, not good for the other people of the world. Next slide, please. How can we keep this collision from happening? We can wish that it will not happen, but that's unlikely. So all our wishes is not going to do any good. However, when other countries also want a multilateral world, then world opinion could change. So for example, not to defend place on Germany, what Germany did a week or so ago is not necessarily following the United States unilateral world. So events like that could change the world order and could change the position of the United States. So when such things happen, we could avoid a world war. If that does not happen, then we really have to rely on a global peace movement. Fortunately, there are a lot of global peace movement over the world. And we need to join forces with these peace movements. And also to achieve the objective of saving lives and eliminate poverty, religious organizations should also join forces. However, that's a very difficult task. And we must undo years of propaganda and propagated news. When we join this global peace movement, we have to be very careful, and we got to nurture and the goals of the global peace movement, because it can easily go some other path, especially with the United States strong record of propaganda and all kinds of think tanks and doing all kinds of things, so they can easily guide you in the wrong path. The next There's one important topic which I believe our panelists did not really address. And that is the role, the conflicts between first generation Chinese Americans and second and third generation Chinese Americans. And we can clearly see that among our children, our grandchildren, and so on. Chinese Americans love both the United States and China, and they want the best of both countries. But however, there's a big generation gap between first generation and second and third generation. So how do we address that gap? I'll go to that in a couple of minutes. One is to go beyond the superficial mass media reports and distinguish reality from fiction. Critical role for Chinese Americans to play. And I think this is an important issue for ISOC to lead and address. Maybe ISSCO to lead and address. This is a difficult question. I do not have the solution, but there's something we could try, because one of the things that we have been involved is trying to educate United States high school teachers on study tours to China, and many of us have been involved in that. Instead of just educating U.S. teachers to study tours to China, we could try to educate second and third generation Chinese Americans on study to China. Of course, we'll be accused of brainwashing them and so on. But I think that's one thing we can do. For example, we can teach about modern Chinese history of past 200 years. We have heard so much about the Taiwan issues. If you really look at U.S.-China history since the Second World War, look at what happened in the 1943 Cairo Declaration, in the 1945 Potsdam Declaration, and look at the 1945 Japanese surrender. They all say that Taiwan should go back in its entirety to China. All of it says that. The United States signed that, but the United States did not follow that. So all this talk about Taiwan is a bunch of baloney. If they really understand history, they will know that Taiwan is an integral part of China. And we really have to study for foreign policy of regime changes during the last 70 years or so. So this is one possibility we can do through education. Okay, so that's, I would like to now open the floor for any question. We have 10 minutes before your dinner time. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the panel. It was very exciting. And although the prognosis is rather pessimistic, I'm from Taiwan, and therefore the Taiwan question really is pressing to me. So my question to the panel is this. It seems to me one of the issues that has been presented here is that Taiwan is an issue between China and America. And part of that is actually the reconciliation or reunification is not happening, and which unfortunately is not a very tenable position, at least in terms of the social discussion in Taiwan. And the reason for that is because China has never renounced the use of force against Taiwan, despite the call for peaceful unification. And therefore, I wonder what is the role and the thinking of the panelists here on this question about U.S. About the China's refusal to not use force. That would be a huge step forward in thinking about unification, but that has never happened in the last 50 years. And what would be, would that be a way to advance the agenda here towards peace? Thank you.
Can I answer that first?
I leave it to my panelists.
Okay.
Then I can ask something.
I think there's a chicken and egg situation here because the current government, the current Taipei government, refused to recognize the one China principle. They do not want to admit that Taiwan is part of China. As long as the Taipei government does not recognize that principle, there's no basis for peaceful negotiations And therefore, Beijing will say, we are in favor of peaceful negotiations, but we will not withdraw the option of going to war if we have to. So there is this chicken and egg situation as to which comes first. But before the current government, the previous government did recognize the one China principle, and they were getting along very, very well. And one of the things that the people of Taiwan don't seem to appreciate and understand is that the trade imbalance between Taiwan and mainland China deliberately on the part of Beijing is to be so overwhelmingly in favor of Taiwan, it keeps the Taiwan economy going and going very strongly. If they ever decide to go to war, they will stop the trade and they will put the Taiwan economy in very dire straits. That's my take.
I'll have I think the first thing to understand is that Taiwan is recognized as part of China by people in Taiwan and in China. And that's the understanding of the entire planet. If you ask people to show you the Taiwanese Declaration of Independence, nobody can point to it because it doesn't exist, because the Taiwan ROC Constitution declares that Taiwan is part of China. Now, the other piece of this is that it's not simply a matter of Taiwan Island becoming quote unquote sovereign or figuring things out peacefully. You are avoiding the elephant in the room, which is the United States. And until the 1970s, the United States was using Taiwan Island as a forward base with which to threaten and attack China. And that has always been the case. For example, I come from Korea. There was an alliance of dictators between Taiwan and Korea and the Philippines. And they were spreading anti-communist terror around the planet. For example, Roberto D'Aubuisson, who was the genocidaire of El Salvador. Do you know where he was trained? He was trained in Taiwan. Taiwan is not some kind of innocent lamb in this game. It is a pawn of the United States. And any move towards independence or any demand for China to desist from the threat of kinetic engagement plays directly into US geostrategic design, which is to rip Taiwan away. It is the center of the first island chain. It is 80 miles away from the Chinese coastline. And it controls two submarine channels, the Bashi Channel and another channel that determine whether China can have a deterrent or not. So it is like a pawn which has advanced to the seventh row of the chessboard. If it coordinates with the United States, which it is starting to do, then it becomes an existential threat. And that is why China cannot renounce the use of force. Mao said that reunification with China would probably take 100 years. And the commitment was for peaceful reunification. But it's clear that the United States wants to turn Taiwan into an imperial outpost, as it has in the past. And it wants to use Taiwan as a trigger with which to attack and take down China. That's Elbridge Colby and the Hawks at CNAS. Read their doctrine. It's very specific. And under those circumstances, China cannot back down. It has to have its own version of strategic ambiguity.
Thank you. Thank you, KJ. Next question Any more question?
Let me just say something, Don. I talk about geopolitics and economics. Just very simply, there is no nation of Taiwan. There's no country. Taiwan is a place. The government, the country that is in Taiwan, where you're from, is the Republic of China. That's the formal government, right? I mean, that's what it is. You look, you ever see the flag of the Republic of China? It is the old flag from the Sun Yat-sen days. It still flies. It represents, supposedly, China. So how can you, it boggles the mind that many people have forgotten this, that you still have the Chinese Civil War. You still have a defeated party that is defended, protected by international forces. If it didn't have that protection, it would resolve within days. So when we talk about, I'm very hesitant even to use the word Taiwan because it suggests that it is an independent. Now we hear on the news, Taiwan and an independent self-governing entity. That's the CBS News kind of different phrase, which is a total distortion. I mean, it may be, but they can't say that it's the contender for the legitimacy of to govern the China, that 1.4 billion people is what the ROC still formally, as a government, is based upon. And that is universally around the globe still recognized. Now the quandary, and I have lots of affection. I have a lot of friends in Taiwan, and I'm very, very, very fond of much in Taiwan. And I would hate to see anything happen there. The quandary is that, well, why doesn't the ROC say, now I'm in the Republic of Taiwan? Now that is something entirely, and that's what we can talk about, but that's a declaration of war.
Thanks to all the speakers for elucidating what is at stake. I am somewhat concerned, though, by the ways in which Taiwan is positioned as a pawn, and it has been historically and continues to be. But there's increasingly a discussion of settler colonialism in many fields of study, including China studies. And so to think about Taiwan, not just either a possession of the United States or a possession of China, but perhaps a place in which people of Taiwanese ancestry want to lay claim themselves. And so I'm just curious about how you see this conversation in relation to US-China relations. I also wanted to raise this question. I read Joanne Chu's book, which I thought was very disturbing, called China Unbound. And I certainly see the racial persecution that's happening in the United States. But her book focuses on the ways in which the Chinese state is surveilling overseas Chinese, trying to manipulate them, to try to censor their political activities and their family kinship ties. I read it right before Halloween, I think last year, and it seemed like a scary story to me. But I'm curious about how do you reconcile then this narrative of Chinese suppression and surveillance along with a US narrative of racial suppression as well.
Okay.
So, settler colonialism is a very interesting terminology, and it's also really something that can be a very triggering, but also misleading term. When I think of the settler colonial states, I think of the white settler colonial genocidal states of the UK, Australia, Canada, the United States, etc. Now, does Taiwan have the same history of settler colonialism? What you have over a period of 10 to 8,000 years is waves and waves of immigrants from the Yalu River Basin who went to Taiwan. They became the Austronesians. They traveled to the rest of the Pacific. And then sometime around the 16th century, Taiwan was colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese. And these people were, by then, they were the people of the Yalu River Basin who had become indigenous. That was changed when Koxinga came in, drove out the Portuguese, and he declared himself as a Ming loyalist. During the Portuguese occupation, again, waves of Chinese laborers had been employed by the Portuguese. And so they became part of this general ferment. But there are a few things we have to understand. First, the Taiwanese who claim this indigeneity are usually not people who are actually indigenous prior to the 16th century. They're the people who came over with Chiang Kai-shek or slightly before that. And they are actually people from the south of the Min River. That is why the Taiwanese language is called Minnanhua, right? It means south of the Min River. Where is the Min River? It's in Fujian, it's in China. So it's a strange kind of indigeneity that they're claiming when they are actually coming from China. It's a kind of false or fraudulent indigeneity that they're making up for themselves. The real indigenous people, the people living who resisted the Japanese, these people are actually closely allied with the political parties that seek reunification with China. Go ask them. I'm talking about the Pan Blues. Check them out. They want connection, reunification with China. And so when you take a kind of a Western, postmodern, post-colonial theoretical framework and try to impose it onto areas that have no historical and geostrategic, geopolitical history, then I think you're misapplying the term. And you're actually appropriating the real colonial, anti-colonial struggles that have happened all over the third world.
Let me add a comment there.
Well, let me make a quick comment first.
Go ahead, George.
The cream of the crop of the younger generation of Taiwanese, couple of million, give or take, they are living and working on mainland China, either for Taiwan companies or for mainland companies. When they go back to Taiwan, they never talk about how things are in Shanghai, Kunshan, Dongguan, or anywhere else, because when they try to say that, they are laughed out of the house, laughed out of the bar or wherever they're gathering, because the people that is in Taiwan are so fully indoctrinated that they are still much better off in Taiwan than they are on the mainland. So there is that bias that is in there, and it's been like that since for the last 20 plus years. I want to make a prediction. It's really the US that is pushing Taiwan to start a firefight with China, like Ukraine with Russia. Most of the intellectuals, commentators that are independent and not aligned with the DPP knows what the situation is and knows that it would be a total disaster if Taiwan were to start a firefight with the PLA. But I would go further. If China sees that a war is inevitable because of the US support, the first thing they do is not to fire the missiles onto Taiwan, because they said they would not fire on their own people. Taiwan people are Chinese. The first thing the PLA will do is to take out the carriers, the US carriers sailing around Japan and the China seas, because if they mean business, that's the message that they will send to Washington.
Okay. We have been advised that we have to end this talk right now. But I'm going to make one last comment since George cut me off. The United States government has no role to play, should not have any say to decide on the internal issue of China. Furthermore, when the United States is involved, they do not have the interest of the Chinese people or the people in Taiwan in mind. They don't have their interest. They will have their own interest, which is not in the best interest of the Chinese. That's all I want to say.
Yeah.
I just want to thank all the speakers, the panelists, and thank you very much for sitting between us and your dinner.
I just want to go ahead and close the conference with a few minutes of comments. I'm not going to try at all to summarize, the 2-day event. I think we've had an amazing set of scholars, community leaders, journalists, judges who have spoken out. And I think we've heard them loud and clear. These are very complex issues. And, you know, from this panel, I realize what a precarious state we're in at this moment. And I think it is a wake-up call to all of us to think carefully and to act with our full conscience in mind. So this is a conference that brings together a global community. And I think from the outset in 1992, it was meant to bring academics together to attend to the very issues of our communities all over the world. And I think we've done that in this conference. And I hope that we'll continue to do that for the next 30 years. Thank you. First of all, I want to give a hand of applause to our panelists here. I want to give a hearty round of applause for the staff who have done such an amazing job to make sure all the logistics of this conference went well, all the technology, you know, which is always the main issue. Please stand up to just show who you are. Jess, Deborah, Max, Sophie, and Lisa, Josh, I don't know. Thank you so much. And most of all, I want to really thank all of you, all the presenters, all the participants here for coming to this. And I believe is going to be a historic moment for all of us. And without you, we could not have done it. And thank you for your attention, for your very emotional and passionate speeches, and your deep, deep knowledge of these issues. Thank you.